Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Serra, Assistant Director at the IMF. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this final Capacity Development talk of the 2021 IMF annual meetings. As the global economy emerges from the worst crisis of our lifetimes, paths are diverging across country groups. In particular, many developing and low-income countries are struggling. Progress toward their UN Sustainable Development Goals has become even more challenging than before the pandemic. The IMF provides technical assistance and training to help countries address these challenges and plan for inclusive and sustainable development. For example, last week we heard about the IMF's online learning program, which offers free online courses on many topics, such as revenue forecasting and public financial management. I personally had the honor of contributing to a new online course on inclusive growth, which is very much related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we'll be publishing a companion guidebook on inclusive growth in a couple months. Today's conversation will focus on how the IMF, in collaboration with governments and development partners, can help fill the financing gaps for development. Since domestic revenue mobilization is crucial to financing development, we'll begin with a presentation by Dora Benedect from the Tax Policy Division of the IMF. She'll give us an overview of the current state of SDG financing in developing countries and of key IMF capacity development initiatives. Akib Aslam from the IMF's African Department will discuss issues that are particularly relevant for the African region. Then Victor Liedu, IMF economist on Rwanda, will tell us how Rwanda has been engaging on the SDG agenda. Both Akib and Victor will discuss how IMF capacity development helps support countries in this agenda. And Scott Caldwell from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, one of our key development partners, will tell us why they think domestic revenue mobilization is key for development and how development partners can best support countries' efforts in a coordinated manner. Dora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks everyone for joining us for this talk today. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs in short, represent important benchmarks for human development with an emphasis on sustainability and inclusiveness. While important advances were made before the pandemic, the path to meet the SDGs was extremely challenging for most low-income countries due to significant spending needs. The pandemic and the economic crisis pushed many countries in recession and millions of people to poverty. As revenues collapsed, public spending to support lives and livelihoods increased, and in most low-income developing countries, the pandemic amplified the already large financing needs. In a recent policy paper, we looked at the current state of financing the SDGs using a newly developed macroeconomic framework. We analyzed 4 country cases: Nigeria, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Rwanda. And we found that on average, before the pandemic, these 4 countries needed about 11% of GDP additional financing every year between now and 2030 to be able to meet the SDG targets. As a result of the pandemic and the economic crisis, this financing need further increased to 14% of GDP every year. There is great variation across the 4 countries, though, and Rwanda and Nigeria had much larger financing needs both before and post-pandemic. Most countries face an enormous challenge regarding development, and government policies have a crucial role to play in advancing the agenda. Governments can work towards closing the financing gap through structural reforms, domestic revenue mobilization, improvements in spending efficiency, or catalyzing private investment by strengthening institutions and improving the business climate. Still, even in the medium term, for many countries, the SDG needs far exceed the potential domestic resources that point to the vital role that the international community can play in advancing development. So let me now talk about domestic revenue mobilization and how our capacity development can support countries in this area. Tax capacity is required for sustainable and inclusive growth. The most sustainable source of financing is domestic revenue. Therefore, taxation is at the center of development policies. A previous IMF paper found that there is a tipping point, a minimum level of taxes around 15% of GDP, that a country needs to achieve to be able to accelerate development. But many countries collected below this level even before the pandemic, and the crisis left even less resources for development. Gradually increasing tax-to-GDP ratios through comprehensive tax policy and administration reforms is an ambitious but achievable objective for most low-income developing countries. Most low-income countries collect much less than their tax capacity, which is their potential revenue given country characteristics. This means that their tax effort, the ratio of actual to potential revenues, is well below 100%, leaving scope for increase. The medium-term revenue strategy, or MTRS in short, so the MTRS approach to tax system reform can help countries through this journey to build tax capacity in an enduring way. And IMF Capacity Development can support the process in many ways. The MTRS is a government-led effort to reform the tax system that is embedded in the wider government strategy for economic and social development. It requires a broad support, a whole-of-government buy-in, and the broad social and political commitment to tax system reform. The MTRS has 4 components. The first component is the goal setting. An MTRS is anchored around a medium-term revenue goal that is very often closely linked to the SDGs. But an MTRS can also support other goals such as equity or efficiency. The second component of the MTRS is a high-level medium-term roadmap of tax system reform that covers tax policy, revenue administration, and the legal framework. Exactly what this roadmap and the tax system reform will look like will be country-specific, and it will depend on the existing capacity and the current structure of the tax system. The third component, which is really crucial, is a sustained medium-term government commitment to reform, from the formulation all the way to the implementation. This is where the whole-of-government approach is really essential. This component is absolutely needed to go forward with the tax reform. And the fourth component is the coordinated and aligned capacity-building support to tax system reform, where the IMF, together with other development partners, plays a key role. Our capacity development can help countries at every stage of the MTRS. We provide support in identifying revenue needs, most importantly through the detailed costing of the SDGs. Quantification of spending needs, very importantly the SDG needs, serve as the starting point of the MTRS. Our tax policy, revenue administration, and tax legal capacity development supports reform design and implementation through evaluation, training, policy recommendations, legal drafting, and really importantly, institution building. We also have a wide array of diagnostic tools support countries in domestic revenue mobilization. For example, the TADAT supports the diagnostic of revenue administrations, and the RA-GAP helps identify gaps in revenue collection. Our medium-term capacity development engagement supports countries from the formulation all the way to the implementation. Effective coordination across development partners is very important to avoid gaps and overlaps and to set the right sequencing. And we also support countries in managing partner coordination over the tax system reform process. Now, let me also briefly talk about how IMF capacity development can support spending efficiency. Strong public financial management systems and efficient spending are essential for the sustainability of public finances, effective allocation of resources, and strong, transparent, and accountable institutions. We have developed several comprehensive tools that help with assessment and diagnostic in key areas, such as fiscal transparency evaluations, public investment management assessments, so-called PIMAs, and public expenditure financial accountability. Our expenditure policy capacity development supports countries in enhancing spending efficiency, and public financial management capacity development helps with institution building and enhancing fiscal frameworks to support financing strategies. So, to sum up, developing countries have already faced an enormous challenge in financing development before the pandemic, and the crisis increased the needs even further. Domestic revenue mobilization and increased spending efficiency are some of the most effective ways for authorities to narrow this financing gap. And we, here at the IMF, stand ready to provide capacity development support to countries in all these areas. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Dora. This was a comprehensive overview of how the IMF capacity development can support countries in their development agenda. Now let me turn to Akib, who will tell us about the issues and challenges faced by Sub-Saharan African countries and how our capacity development can help.
Thank you very much, Valerie. The medium-term revenue strategy as a new approach to tax system reform and the capacity development the IMF provides to support it is extremely relevant for Sub-Saharan Africa, as they look forward to not only how to achieve their SDGs, but also how to build back stronger from the recent crisis. Domestic revenue mobilization has been a long-standing priority for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa as a critical means for financing the region's large development needs. Despite steady growth over the past 3 decades, revenue improvements in recent years have been slow and uneven across the region and typically more muted compared to elsewhere in the world. For instance, low-income countries in Sub-Saharan Africa collect around 12% of GDP in taxes on average as of 2020, compared to around 16% for other emerging market and developing economies, and over 25% of GDP in advanced economies. These differences can be explained by persistent structural issues and weak reform efforts across Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there is important variation between countries within the region. However, many tax systems continue to be riddled with exemptions and incentives that undermine the revenue potential of both direct and indirect taxes, problems which are then compounded by poor administration and weak compliance that negatively feed off one another. What's more, many of the problems that existed before the pandemic remain unresolved and were only exacerbated by the sudden stop in global activity and lockdowns, as well as the various tax relief measures. And the concern is that such weak revenue performance will persist in the aftermath. Preliminary high-frequency data compiled by the IMF suggests tax revenue growth turned sharply negative, shrinking by about 15% in 2020 compared to the year before. But the damage was not only limited to tax revenues, with non-tax revenues also falling. However, the size of revenue collapses also varied across the region, with non-resource intensive economies seeing larger falls than resource-intensive economies. Going forward, as the pandemic comes under control, governments face the urgent need to reboot domestic revenue mobilization initiatives to help meet the large spending needs associated with the SDGs. Tax policy reforms will be needed to continue the push to modernize tax systems and enlarge and diversify tax bases. These include broadening the value-added tax base, increasing the progressivity and coverage of personal income taxes, eliminating distortionary corporate income tax exemptions and incentives, and placing a greater emphasis on environmental taxation. However, it is important also to acknowledge that resistance to such reforms is likely to have increased in the wake of the hardship caused by the pandemic. Revenue administrations will also need to develop post-crisis revenue collection plans that set out the necessary actions to restore compliance and secure additional revenue. And the region will need to continue to rely on innovative approaches to old problems, by leveraging the potential from digitalization to broaden tax bases, enhance tax fairness and taxpayer compliance, and increase the efficiency of tax administrations. Digital solutions also present opportunities to open up new or underutilized sources of taxation, such as property taxes, as well as expanding the tax base into the informal sector and limiting the scope for leakages from evasion and corruption. Without reforms, the region is at risk of failing to rebuild the vital fiscal space needed to finance recoveries, improve resilience, keep debt within sustainable limits, and close the widening rift in incomes between poorer and richer countries. And rebuilding this fiscal space means a significant increase in tax capacity and revenues. The success of these reforms will ultimately depend on the strength of basic institutions, and for this reason, focusing efforts on a more sustained, systematic, and strategic approach to revenue mobilization, for example, through medium-term revenue strategies, as Dora explained earlier, will be crucial. What is also important to stress is that previous work at the IMF has highlighted that most sub-Saharan African countries still have considerable potential to collect higher taxes through reforms, to the order of 5% of GDP on average. And historical experience suggests that the conditions for success require attention to many factors related to policy design, institutional development, and political support. And not surprisingly, economic and political stability are preconditions for success. For that reason, capacity development remains critical for the region. Given the vital need for fiscal consolidation, it should come as no surprise that capacity development for domestic revenue mobilization is in high demand. Fortunately, the IMF is already planning to scale up resources in the areas of both tax policy and revenue administration. Thank you, and back to you, Valerie.
Thanks, Akib. Indeed, African countries have been and remain one of our main beneficiaries of capacity development. Victor, our cooperation with the Rwandan authorities has been very strong, both in surveillance and in capacity development. Can you tell us about this experience and what makes this case so successful?
Indeed, Valerie. Rwanda's economic and social progress has been remarkable over the past 25 years, from the end of the genocide until the start of the pandemic. Per capita income more than tripled, and poverty levels were cut by half during this period. Rwanda's domestic revenue mobilization has also improved significantly. Tax to GDP ratios doubled, well exceeding that of peers. The period was marked by sustained reforms that widened the tax base, improved progressivity, and strengthened tax compliance. Seminal reforms, such as establishment and digitalization of Rwanda's revenue authority and the introduction of a value-added tax, have also taken place during this period. This period was also marked by sustained IMF engagements through a series of programs since 1995 and numerous technical assistance and capacity building missions with a very good track record of implementing technical recommendations. Rwanda's success story has been mostly attributed to two factors: institutions and international support. Rwanda's strong commitment to development was crystallized with the creation of institutions that promoted goal setting, ownership, accountability, and adaptation. Goal setting was fostered through an ambitious 20-year implementation through 5-year strategies linked to monitorable indicators. Ownership was built by broad annual consultation processes with strong citizen participation. Accountability was promoted with the creation of performance contracts and the introduction of a code of conduct for government officials, which kept them honest, created a strong drive for results, and a culture of learning and adaptation to achieve these results. The second factor behind Rwanda's success was the strategic use of international support characterized by alignment and coordination. The government increasingly took the reins in deciding how and whether to rely on support from development partners. Even when controversial, the government has been willing to say no to support that was not aligned with their strategies. On the other hand, technical expertise and capacity building aligned with their policies was highly valued. Great emphasis has been placed on coordination, and development partners were asked to reduce their engagement to no more than 3 sectors. This led to significant streamlining and to better results. In short, Rwanda's progress was made possible by homegrown institutions that created a broad mandate for the country's development strategy and a strong drive for results. Government's drive for results, in turn, led to selective and sustained use of external support in the form of capacity building in critical areas for the implementation of the strategy. With domestic revenue mobilization as a critical pillar of Rwanda's development strategies over the years, and the fund strong technical expertise in the area, this institutional environment ultimately created strong incentives for a selective and sustained demand for IMF capacity development with tangible results. Let me now turn to SDG financing, which has become a central focus of IMF engagement in Rwanda lately. Rwanda drafted an ambitious development strategy prior to the pandemic, reflecting sustainable development goals, which were costed with IMF technical support. Achieving the goals, according to our technical assistance, would require an additional 20% of GDP in spending in 2030, relative to what Rwanda was currently spending. Financing SDG needs of this magnitude were clearly challenging and would demand reinvigorating tax reforms, which the fund started to support through a capacity building strategy centered on the design and implementation of a medium-term revenue strategy. The pandemic made the challenge of financing the SDGs even more daunting. On one side, it reversed previous development gains, raising SDG spending needs. On the other, it reduced the fiscal space for SDGs as debt increased markedly to finance the government pandemic response. Recent work done by IMF staff estimated the additional financing needs post-pandemic to meet SDGs to amount to about 5.5% of GDP per year, above those already large needs estimated prior to the pandemic. A combination of domestic revenue mobilization, greater spending efficiency, and policies to attract private financing will reduce the SDGs financing gap by about 1/3. Still, about 2/3 would need to be financed with additional support from development partners and other donors. IMF capacity development activities to support SDG financing have continued during the pandemic. With capacity development support, authorities have formulated their first medium-term revenue strategy that's expected to be launched this year, and forthcoming CD will focus on legislation and implementation of these measures. A forthcoming Public Investment Management Assessment, PIMA, will help identify opportunities to rationalize the use of public resources for public investment, and in doing so, will create more fiscal space to attain the SDGs. In summary, Rwanda has made a remarkable progress on development before the pandemic, helped by strong institutions and a judicious use of international support, including IMF policy advice and capacity building. While the pandemic hit Rwanda's development agenda hard, the authorities remain committed to the SDGs and have continued to rely on IMF support to steer their country back to their remarkable development path.
Well, thank you, Victor. Quite a fascinating progress indeed, and a good example of coordination. Well, Scott, let me turn to you. The UK government, through its development agencies, has long been involved in supporting countries with tax and public financial management reform in Africa. How do you think the medium-term revenue strategy concept has contributed to this agenda, and what value added does it have in the current context?
Thanks, Valerie. Let me start with the current context and then come back to the implications for the medium-term revenue strategy. As we heard earlier, COVID has created an urgent need for some governments to raise more revenue and strengthen their fiscal position. We all know from our own countries how challenging tax and revenue reforms can be, and even committed governments can waver when faced with the need to impose unwelcome tax rises. The need to repair and stabilise public finances post-COVID may, by necessity, reinforce political commitment to potentially difficult reforms. In this context, the medium-term revenue strategy approach is particularly useful because it puts country ownership at its core and helps to harness political commitment. By helping governments to plan and sequence reforms, complex and challenging reforms, the medium-term revenue strategy can help to concentrate political attention on the most critical reform challenges. Once an agreed strategy is in place, partners like the UK can then work alongside the IMF and others to support capacity building and reforms aligned with the plan. Alongside revenue mobilisation, however, we believe that it's important that taxpayers and citizens can see how revenues are raised and how they're used, and that they can be reassured that any additional taxes are being used well. Fiscal transparency and accountability can help to ensure that poor decisions are identified and challenged, and leaders can be held to account for those decisions. With this in mind, we particularly welcome the inclusion of transparency commitments in some of the recent IMF Rapid Credit Facility agreements. And so definitely something we would like to see a lot more of in future. Thanks. Back to you, Valerie.
Scott, you've been working closely with IMF colleagues in several countries. Why is coordination so important? And how can we make it more successful?
I think the first thing to consider here is the political nature and complexity of tax and public finance reforms. It's very easy for efforts to be dissipated across too many priorities, and if development partners are not coordinated, we actually exacerbate this problem. If we're always asking for meetings with the same senior ministers and officials, what we're doing is drawing their time away from the problems and issues that we all want to see addressed. In terms of how to make coordination successful, I see two critical factors. Firstly, development partners should be aligned behind a government plan. A common plan and common understanding of what's needed enables us to coordinate our efforts and partner governments to focus their efforts on a clear and agreed set of priorities. It should be clear to the government and development partners how each strand of support fits together. The second thing, consistent with my earlier answer, the government must own the reforms and lead the coordination process. Whilst development partners can and should coordinate between themselves, there's no substitute for government leadership and coordination. There's a careful balance to be found as development partners have their own strengths and areas which they wish to focus on. And there's a need for some flexibility on all sides to make sure that that coordination and prioritization process works. Development partners can also help by agreeing a lead donor who can act as a focal point for the government and to support wider planning and coordination. One final dimension that helps to bind everything together is having suitable oversight structures in place to support monitoring, coordination, and effective communications between partners. In my experience, it is these factors that are most critical to effective and successful coordination efforts. Thank you. Back to you, Valerie.
Okay, well, fascinating discussion, and thank all of you for sharing your insights. Let's do a few questions. Let me start with you, Dora. The crisis has led to increasing demands for IMF capacity development, putting pressure on our scarce resources to deliver it. So how's the IMF adjusting to meet these demands?
Thank you, Valerie. And I think you touched upon the most important question that we're facing right now. How are we able to boost our capacity development to meet the increasing demand coming from the member countries? Let me touch on two things. So I think one important thing that we can do is to adjust how we deliver capacity development. And the other really important point is how we are able to finance our capacity development. So the pandemic obviously put a lot of challenges in the way we are able to reach our member countries in our capacity development. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that it actually opened up new ways to interact with our member countries. I think we have been trying to innovate in this area, and we are planning to maintain this innovative approach going forward in our capacity development delivery. Let me just mention one example. We have been able to organize remote workshops, online workshops, also on the SDG areas. One, for example, in the African region, another one in the Asia-Pacific region, where we were able to reach much more people through this online modality of delivery than what we could do before the pandemic. But I think it's also important to mention how we can leverage more expertise by having this blended or remote delivery method going forward in our capacity development. But the other really important question is how we can finance this increase in capacity development delivery. I think you're aware that half of our capacity development has already been financed by our external donor partners, our strategic partners, even until now. And I think our donor partners really stepped up during the pandemic. It's good to mention this COVID response CD delivery fund that was set up just very recently to support our most vulnerable member countries. But we can also think about the revenue mobilization thematic fund that many of our strategic partners set up a few years ago. So I think it's good to emphasize the important role that donor financing plays in delivering capacity development. And it's really important, most importantly, for our most vulnerable countries, member countries, low-income developing countries, and fragile states going forward. So we really count on this support going forward, just like in the past. Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks very much, Dora. Scott, let me turn to one question for you. From an external perspective, what do you think IMF's capacity development offers that's different from what other development partners offer?
I think the IMF's broader role and mandate puts it in a unique position among the development partners. And although some governments have a particularly strong relationship with one development partner or another, the IMF tends to be seen as a really informed and trusted partner almost across the board. And I think it has developed a very strong reputation for specialist independent advice and is trusted by a lot of governments to engage on very sensitive issues. And I think that really, the breadth of that reputation really does set the IMF apart. I think another thing just very recently is how well the IMF capacity development adapted to some of the challenges around COVID, and particularly around the shift to remote delivery and new ways of working. And we've certainly noted that in the capacity development initiatives that we have supported, that we've funded. Having said that, I think the remote delivery, although it's worked very well in the short term, the benefits of it may be slightly time limited. The remote delivery possibly piggybacked on established relationships and on country knowledge, but the longer time goes on, the more those can become less effective and less valuable. I mean, that's not an issue that's specific to the IMF by any means. I think it's something that we all need to think about as this, hopefully the pandemic passes, and we need to think, how do we adjust further as we look to the future and plan our future support? Thanks.
Thanks, very good points. Maybe time for one more question. Victor, you said that selectivity and coordination were important for the IMF's successful engagement with Rwanda. Is there anything more you want to tell us about this story?
I think another very important element of the successful fund engagement in capacity development was also the integration of that CD with program activities, IMF program activities, because that really created another layer of incentive for authorities to see the end results of that capacity development. You could see that capacity development really building into results that would be translated in better macroeconomic policies for the country. So domestic revenue mobilization was a critical part of that capacity development. And they knew that by building technical expertise on how to raise more revenues, how to improve the tax potential of their tax system, they would be creating resources to finance their needed government objectives.
Okay, thank you. Well, before we close this event, I'd like to leave you with a few important messages. Developing countries have already faced an enormous challenge in financing development before the pandemic, and the crisis increased the financing needs even further. Tax revenue is the most important source of development financing, and domestic revenue mobilization will be essential during the recovery. Also, increased spending efficiency is important to create more fiscal space for development. The crisis has had a devastating effect on most low-income and developing countries, including in Sub-Saharan Africa. Domestic revenue mobilization was already a challenge before the pandemic, but the crisis compressed fiscal space through increased spending and collapsing revenues. We heard about Rwanda and how it's made remarkable progress before the pandemic. And with coordinated IMF capacity development, it's determined to put development back on track. We also heard how important government ownership and donor coordination are in these efforts. IMF capacity development, together with other institutions, has been helping countries in these areas for many years, and we remain committed to continue this support. Okay, so I would also like to thank our large network of development partners, including the United Kingdom, represented here by Scott, for supporting IMF capacity development work, including through our regional centers around the world and our thematic funds, like the Revenue Mobilization Thematic Fund. That plays a crucial role in supporting the financing of SDGs and is set to grow even further. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I wish you all well, and see you next time.